I used to believe in merit, not because I was naive, but because my whole life was built on it. I worked harder than everyone else, not just to prove something, but because I had no safety net. Every A I earned in college was a rung on a ladder I was determined to climb. My parents told me I'd have to work twice as hard for half the recognition, so I did. Graduating from Columbia with honors, a degree in business administration, and 3 internships under my belt. I thought I was ready to take on the world. My resume was crisp, my LinkedIn was polished, and my cover letters were written with the care of someone carving her name into stone. And yet, the world didn't take me on. It barely noticed me. I applied for 146 jobs in the first 3 months after graduation. Entry level, assistant level, coordinator level. I wasn't aiming for the stars, just a foot in the door. And still, nothing. No interviews, no callbacks, no interest. I watched my classmates, some with lower GPAs and fewer credentials, land positions within weeks. They posted their office selfies on Instagram and tagged the companies I had dreamt of working for. Meanwhile, I kept checking my email like an addict, waiting for a fix that never came. At first, I blamed myself. Maybe my resume wasn't formatted right. Maybe my cover letter was too long. I rewrote it 5 times, then 10, then I started paying for professional edits. Nothing changed. One night I called my mom in tears. I was lying on my mattress in my tiny apartment, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I had made a terrible mistake, believing this country would treat me fairly if I just did everything right. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "Baby, they can't see you past your name." I stared at my phone. What? You know what I mean. Janelle Thomas might sound fine to us, but to them? They read it and already picture you. And maybe that's all they need to decide. I hated how much that made sense. That week I created a new email, a new resume, a new identity. Jenna T. Thompson. Same school, same experience, but now with a name that passed the paper bag test. I didn't expect it to work, but it did. Within a week, I had 4 callbacks, 2 phone screens, 1 in-person interview. Same resume, same words, just different letters at the top. I sat in my first interview for a marketing assistant role and listened as the woman across from me said, "We loved your resume. You're exactly what we've been looking for." I wanted to scream. After that, I kept both profiles going, Janelle and Jenna. I sent out applications in pairs. Janelle got silence. Jenna got interviews. I started logging it all in a spreadsheet. Dates, companies, responses. My background in data made it second nature. And the pattern was undeniable. The numbers didn't lie. One night, after a particularly brutal rejection from a job I applied for as Janelle, but had already gotten an interview for as Jenna, I decided I needed to do more than document it. I needed to expose it, but I didn't know how. What if they found out I was behind both applications? What if it ruined my chances forever? What if they turned it around on me, said I was the one being deceptive? But then I thought, what do I really have to lose? I've already been rejected 146 times. They say silence is a form of violence. I used to think that phrase was dramatic, maybe something poets and protesters said to stir up guilt. But after that spreadsheet kept growing, after Janelle got ignored and Jenna got praised, I started to feel it in my chest, like a hand slowly closing around my lungs. Silence was hurting me. It was erasing me. I kept working both names, like it was a science project. I was methodical. Identical resumes, identical cover letters, identical timestamps. I only changed the name, nothing else. And the more results I got, the more undeniable it became. But here's the part that messes with your mind. You start to wonder who you are when the world only wants a version of you that isn't you. I got hired under the Jenna alias, a sleek downtown marketing firm, mostly white, mostly young. They called themselves a family, which should have been a red flag. The kind of family that only tolerates you if you don't talk about race at dinner. My first week, people were nice, polite, smiled when they passed me in the hallway. But there was always that pause, that brief flicker in their eyes when they saw me, like they were recalibrating. One coworker said, "Oh, I didn't expect you to look so young." I knew what she meant. She meant black. My manager, Melanie, was a woman who used the phrase, "I don't see color," with the same frequency most people say hello. She told me on day 2 that she was so proud to have a diverse team. I looked around. There were 46 employees. 3 of us were not white. I guess that made us a collectible set. Still, I stayed quiet, smiled, thanked her, because Jenna was employed and Janelle was not. But you can't hide forever. Not when your name, your hair, your skin, your voice, they all speak truths you've been trained to whisper. It started small. At the Monday meeting, someone cracked a joke about ghetto names. Everyone laughed. I didn't. In the Slack thread, people posted reaction GIFs, all white faces. I posted one with a black actress. No one reacted. The next day, that post was gone. I brought my natural curls to work one Friday. Melanie asked if it was part of a costume. I laughed, like it didn't hurt, but it did. A lot. Then came the mistake. Payroll sent my first check, but instead of Jenna T. Thompson, it said Janelle Thomas. I froze. My chest went ice cold. HR must have cross-referenced my social security number and real name during onboarding, and the system updated my profile. By Tuesday, Melanie asked to have a word. We sat in her office, a glass cube where privacy is a lie and everything echoes. She smiled like it was a performance review, not a confrontation. "So," she said, dragging out the word like she was flipping through files in her brain. "I noticed a discrepancy with your legal name." I nodded slowly. "Yes, my legal name is Janelle Thomas. Jenna was a nickname I used on my resume." Melanie tilted her head. "Why the alias?" I looked at her, really looked, and I knew this was the moment. I could lie, say something bland, or I could burn it all down. I said, because when I applied under my real name, I didn't get interviews. But when I changed it, suddenly, I was qualified. Silence. Melanie blinked, then blinked again. "Are you saying we're racist?" "I'm saying the data speaks for itself." She leaned back, arms crossed. "That's a serious accusation, Janelle." I nodded. "So is ignoring 146 applications." She didn't fire me. Not right away. That would have looked too obvious. But from that day on, I became invisible. Emails went unanswered. My tasks were quietly reassigned. I stopped getting invited to meetings. My name was left off memos. I was erased, but still expected to show up. I started documenting everything: screenshots, timestamps, ignored messages, misattributed work. If they wanted silence, I was going to give them a file loud enough to scream. The final straw came in Q2. I'd led the creative on a campaign that increased engagement by 34%. My name wasn't mentioned in the client call. Melanie took credit. The team applauded her. She looked at me and smiled. That night, I opened my spreadsheet. I added a new tab: internal discrimination. I knew what I had to do. One day, I walked into the kitchen to grab a cup of coffee and overheard a conversation between 2 colleagues, Carla and John. They didn't notice me as I stood there, listening to them discuss the corporate politics and decisions. John said, "I don't know, Carla. I think she's here just because we need to have black people on the team. Sometimes they pick them just to keep the balance. It's not like she's actually talented or anything." I froze. My fingers clenched around the coffee cup. I knew he was talking about me, about how I had been chosen not because of my skills, but because of my appearance. Carla stayed silent, but her gaze was different. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to walk away, but I stayed. Melanie never mentioned that incident in her office. It was the silence that spoke louder than any words could. I kept working, but it wasn't as simple as it used to be. I felt like I was on the edge, like everything I did didn't matter. My ideas weren't taken seriously, and even when I brought up something important in meetings, it was ignored. I realized that my presence here was just for show. My name didn't matter. I was here not to solve problems, but to fit into the image they wanted to portray. Things got worse when I was tasked with a project for an advertising campaign. It was an important assignment, and I thought it would be my chance to show what I was capable of. But soon, everything changed. I noticed my name wasn't even mentioned in the documentation, and all the decisions were made without me. I was simply a worker, executing orders, and even when the project delivered great results, my colleagues said it was the team's achievement, not mine. One day, I couldn't take it anymore. I approached Melanie when we were alone in her office. "Melanie, why am I not getting the recognition I deserve?" I asked. She looked at me, a bit surprised, but then returned to her tablet. "You're doing your job, but you need to work as a team, not just individually. You can't expect recognition for everything you do," she replied, without even looking up. It wasn't just ignorance. It was a blatant refusal to recognize my existence as a professional. By then, I knew this wasn't just about being overlooked in the workplace. It was a fight for my right to be heard. This was a silent war that I was losing, not knowing how to fight it. Melanie always said that we're all one team, but in reality, I was an outsider in that team. I was always the one to be ignored. I asked myself, if I stay, what will change? Or should I leave and let them deal with the consequences of what they had done? My battle became internal. I began to question myself. Could I keep being part of this team when I was being suppressed? When I wasn't valued? I realized the answer wasn't clear, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't allow this to continue. I had to take a step. And as scary as it was, I understood that true freedom lies in walking away when necessary, not staying in a place that is killing you from the inside. And then, one day, I made my decision. I wrote my resignation letter, but not just any resignation letter. I wrote a letter that openly addressed what had led me to this decision. I spoke about racism, about being undervalued and ignored. I wrote about how every effort I put into my work had been dismissed, and my voice silenced. I'm leaving because I deserve more. I deserve a place where I'm respected and valued. I'm leaving because there's no place for me here. I ended the letter. When I handed the letter to Melanie, her expression didn't change. She took it as if it were just another piece of paper, but I knew that for me, this was a step that would change everything. I wasn't that woman anymore, the one who could be ignored. I was someone who had finally spoken her truth. I left her office with a strange sense of finality. The door clicked shut behind me, and suddenly, the weight of my decision started to sink in. I felt a little lighter, but at the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling of emptiness. I had walked away, but was it enough? Would it change anything? I realized something important in that moment. My resignation wasn't about me walking out. It was about giving them a chance to face the consequences of their actions. The silence I had endured for so long was finally over, but the question still lingered. What would happen now? The next few days were surreal. I didn't go back to the office. I had taken time off, trying to figure out my next steps. It was during this time that I started to research other companies, organizations where my skills might actually be appreciated. But there was something deeper inside me, something I couldn't ignore. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that my resignation wasn't just about finding a new job. It was about dismantling the system that had allowed me to be invisible in the first place. How many others had suffered in silence like I had? How many others were quietly enduring racism in their workplaces? This wasn't just my fight anymore. This was bigger than me. As so, I started reaching out to people I knew in the industry, people who had experienced similar struggles. Slowly but surely, a network began to form. I realized that if I wanted to make a real difference, I couldn't do it alone. I needed others to stand with me. I contacted former colleagues, friends, and even strangers who had worked in corporate settings and experienced discrimination. We shared our stories, our pain, and our anger. And then we made a decision. We would go public. We would expose the corporate world for what it was, a place where Black professionals were too often pushed aside, ignored, and silenced. The more people I spoke to, the more I realized that my resignation was just the first step. Now, it was time for action. I knew what I was doing wasn't going to be easy. The companies I was about to challenge were powerful. The people I was about to speak out against had influence and wealth, but I had already been silenced once. I wasn't going to let that happen again. We formed a group of former employees, whistleblowers, and activists who were determined to take down the walls of corporate silence. We drafted a statement, a collective testimony of the discrimination we had faced, the systemic issues we had witnessed, and the profound lack of accountability that had allowed these problems to persist for so long. The statement was a call to arms. It wasn't just about my experience. It was about everyone who had ever been overlooked, dismissed, or belittled simply because of the color of their skin. We were finally going to be heard. We weren't going to stay quiet anymore. But as we prepared to release it, I realized something important. We weren't just calling out these companies. We were demanding change. We were asking for accountability. The time for silence was over. This was the reckoning, and it was going to be louder than anything they had ever heard before. When we released the statement, the reactions came quickly. Some people were supportive. Others, predictably, tried to discredit us. But there was one thing that stood out. We weren't alone anymore. Our voices were being heard. The stories we had shared, the pain we had experienced, was being acknowledged. And for the first time in my career, I felt like I had truly made a difference. I wasn't just an employee who had left. I was a voice for change. And as more people began to join our cause, I realized that the quiet war wasn't just mine anymore. It was a movement. The aftermath of our statement was intense. Interviews, media coverage, and corporate investigations followed. But even amidst the chaos, I felt a strange peace. I had taken a stand. I had raised my voice. And for once, I knew that change was coming. It wasn't going to happen overnight, but the wheels were turning, and they couldn't be stopped. We had made sure of that. As I reflected on everything that had happened, I realized how far I had come. From that quiet girl who had been too scared to speak up, to the woman who had led a movement for change, I had found my voice. And now, it was time for others to find theirs. I sat in a meeting room with the rest of the group, going over the progress we had made. Our campaign was gaining momentum, and more companies were being forced to address their internal issues. We had changed the conversation in corporate America, and there was no going back. But it was still exhausting. The constant pressure, the threats, the uncertainty, it was all taking a toll. At times, I questioned whether it was all worth it. But then I thought about the people who were now speaking out, the ones who had once been afraid to share their own stories. They were finally being heard. That made it all worth it. One of the most pivotal moments came when a major company, one of the biggest corporations in the country, publicly acknowledged the systemic racism within their organization. They admitted to the issues we had called out, and, for the first time, they announced a comprehensive plan to address their practices. It wasn't just a corporate apology, it was a commitment to change. That was the moment I knew we had won. It wasn't just the company's response, it was the recognition that our voices had made an undeniable impact. But our victory wasn't just in corporate acknowledgement. It was in the conversations happening everywhere. Schools, workplaces, families, and communities were all discussing racism and inequality in ways they never had before. People were asking questions, challenging old norms and demanding change. I received messages from people all over the country. Some of them were survivors of discrimination. Others were allies. But all of them were grateful for the work we had done. The momentum was building, and the change was palpable. As we continued to hold corporations accountable, we also worked on supporting other marginalized voices. We knew that this fight couldn't just be about one group. It had to be about all the people who had faced discrimination and been denied opportunities. We started to advocate for policies that would provide support to underrepresented communities, pushing for legislation that would hold companies accountable for their actions. It felt like we were creating real, lasting change. The corporate world and the world at large was finally paying attention. The old systems of power were crumbling, and new possibilities were emerging. By the time the first year of our movement had passed, we had seen significant improvements. New laws had been passed, new policies were in place, and the dialogue around racism had shifted. We had not only exposed the systemic problems, we had also provided a roadmap for change. But the real victory came when I saw the faces of people who had been affected. They were no longer silent. They were standing tall, demanding the respect and dignity they deserved. And that, more than anything, made the journey worthwhile. The world wasn't perfect. There was still work to be done. The fight was ongoing. But in that moment, as I looked at the people who had joined this cause, the ones who had fought alongside me, I knew we had achieved something incredible. We had forced change, not just for us, but for future generations. It wasn't just about corporations anymore. It was about a world where every voice mattered, where every person was valued, and where no one was left behind. We had opened doors that had been closed for far too long. And no matter how difficult the fight had been, we had emerged victorious. As I took a step back, reflecting on everything we had achieved, I felt a deep sense of gratitude. We had stood up together and fought for something that was bigger than ourselves. We had made history, and this was just the beginning.